the scales have been lifted from my eyes as far as the skepticism of the American empire. Okay, so I get it. It's a $65 trillion commercial empire. We use the guise of humanitarianism in order to kill people, but like
it's much worse than you say, sir. It's
well, really probably, and we could get into the much worse. Maybe you could convince me that it's an irredeemable construct. But the point is that there's some things here that I think do require some level of like reverence and respect. So, for instance, if we were at the peak of the Roman Empire, immediately after, I don't know, the Caesars had taken control, or shortly before, but after they had taken Egypt and they had grain and they were taking over the northern territories and all that kind of stuff, you can point out and say, the Republic has fallen. We're under a bunch of dictators. The dictators are kleptomaniac, nepotistic bastards who start civil wars every 30 years. The only way they're able to keep the peace is by launching wars against the Germans, blah, blah, blah. And you can have all the criticisms of the Rome at its peak, but you also have to concede, that it's also feeding a few million people and creating some of the most impressive technological and cultural works of that time. So that's the way that I view the American empire, where you can concede all of its nefariousness, and you can concede the humanitarianism being the cloak through which they commit, murder and lies and diplomacy and these little rhetorical games that disgust you. But then you also have to concede that there's like material, I don't want to say good because that's a loaded word, but material benefit that is derived even from plebeians such as yourself and I, who have plastics and cheap access to oil and technology and computers and microchips and books and the internet and all that kind of crap, where we are the beneficiaries of empire.
So two things on that. One is that I think when people who... It's so hard to go, like, even as someone who's been red pilled, for 15 years, like, I'm still picking sort of bits of like Noam Chomsky out of my tibia, and and it's like when you see someone who sort of has a lot, like, even your conception of American empire, I think owes a lot to that school of thought. And I have a slightly different, essentially, when you look at America's power and you say empire, you're talking about the small amount of what you might call hard power that exists in this world. And soft power is a much more important part of that. And it's essentially a revolutionary power. And it's a power both to create revolution and to preserve and protect revolution. In Latin America, for instance, that power really starts with the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine is, in fact, as many people know, a piece of British foreign policy where Britain was like, I'm going to prevent the monarchies of the old world from getting their revolted colonies back. So when you basically see the revolts of these colonies, and that's sort of straight through the Napoleonic Wars and the end of Spanish and Portuguese rule in Latin America, straight through to the decolonialization of Africa up in the 60s, when you don't see those as consequences of Anglo-American foreign policy, you're sort of once again missing the elephant in the room. You're like, why did all of these European empires decay? Why did Africa fall into like chaos and ruin? It must have been like, what Harold Macmillan called the wind of change. It must have been just something that happened. It wasn't something that happened. It was U.S. foreign policy. It was U.S. diplomacy. And so, if you look, for example...
Can you explain how we affected Africa?
Oh, sure. We affected Africa by putting our feet on the necks of Belgium, for example, to be like, okay, we're going to punish you diplomatically and economically. So the case that I know best is really Suez. So in the Suez crisis of 1956, one thing most people don't know, which still kind of blows my mind, is that the alignment in Suez was very interesting. It was the U.S. and the USSR were on the same side, Britain, Israel, and France were on the other side. And these were the last sort of generation of kind of colonialist, imperialist leaders in Britain and France. The US and the USSR simply would not let it happen. It would not let Britain basically restore order in its former colony of Egypt. And one of the things that happened, you know how US and Soviet vessels used to sort of play tag at sea and engage in like dangerous maneuvers? The Sixth Fleet actually did this with the Royal Navy as it was on its way to Suez in 1956. And moreover, Eisenhower called up Anthony Eden, cursed at him, or at least used, quote, barnyard language, and basically was like, you want to eat, you want oil, you want your debts paid, like, you know, basically fuck off Nasser. And then Nasser decided he'd rather go with the Soviets anyway. So essentially, when you imagine, a step that I would be very much in favor of, which is an American Brezhnev doctrine, not Gorbachev doctrine. Sorry, we have the Brezhnev.
Did you go in the wrong direction, real quick?
Exactly. The Brezhnev doctrine is what we have now. Sorry, the Gorbachev doctrine, where Gorbachev comes out and he says to this Eastern European empire, he's like, "Hey, Poland. Hey, Czechoslovakia. Hey, East Germany. You know we had this thing about socialist brotherhood, and we have this thing called the Warsaw Pact, where we all met up in Warsaw and promised to be socialist brothers. Well, you know, I got some bad news for you. Bad news is there's no socialist brotherhood. It's not a pact. There's nothing Polish about the Warsaw Pact. You know, actually, you're just external provinces. And in fact, you may have these politicians. They even win. They had elections in all these countries. You have these politicians. You know, they're ruling in, Berlin and Warsaw and Prague. You know, they claim to be German, Polish, Czech. They are. That's the language they grew up speaking. But I got to tell you, they work for us. They've always worked for us.
Curtis, I got to step in here for a bit. So what you guys were talking about right now in relation to the Warsaw Pact and the globo-homo influence, if you will, that the United States has inflicted upon the rest of the world.
Or the regional anti-homo Russian colonial influence.
Sure, absolutely. No, but specifically, if we just stick to that particular thing, I am of two minds here. Number one, I think it's very dumb for the United States to waste energy on either helping something like United Fruit back in the day or on maintaining this kind of globo-homo thing around the world. But at the same time, I would be very foolish if I were to say that there would not be a gap of power if the United States was to pack its bags and say, you know what, you guys could do whatever you want, like we're not going to mind that much if Russia starts taking over chunks of the Eastern European world. And we're just going to stick to our own guns over here, because there's not going to be an end to it, and it's a question of when exactly do we start fighting? Do we fight when Russia's weak, or do we fight when Russia, like Kirby, has sucked so many of these countries up into itself that it's become way stronger than it is right now? Maybe China's going to start looking slightly differently at Russia than it's looking at it right now and think, maybe this place has got potential. So that's the thing that I want to avoid.
Just to back this perspective, perhaps with the globo homo, again, said relatively positively for the homos in chat. Basically, like, funny. These interests are, you can say that, like, oh, we shouldn't send, goon squads to Brazil or to banana republics, literal banana republics, in order to enforce our will and our material interest. But then, like, as an example, we do have this soft power, minor hard power, pseudo, if you don't want to call it imperial, we could call it like hegemonic or something, order. And as a result, there would be a lot of material benefits that could potentially backslide, that a lot of the people who are in charge of the world they're not going to let happen, because it's not in their interest to allow it to happen. And not just that, but like these people have some level of justification. So for instance, like, if we just let South America, we're just like, hey, you do whatever you want to do. Who gives a shit? I'm an American. I only care about America. Let's only handle America. And then next day, Bolsonaro has a coup. Well, the rebels, as a result, they start burning the, banana or avocado or guava or whatever the fuck they have fields in protest against.
The next minute we have no bananas.
The bananas are, God forbid, 30 cents more expensive than they were the week before. That's also an alternative, where we still have access to our goods, but when you add it up, it's millions and billions and trillions of dollars.
the vision of what sort of U.S. foreign policy is like meant to do even is just a strange like blast from the past. The main beneficiary of U.S. foreign policy is U.S. foreign policy. It doesn't have a purpose. It just exists because it exists. Let me give you a more concrete example. Brazil is a country that most Americans know a little less than Mexico. So let's apply this strategy to Mexico. We're going to say to Mexico, hey, you know how we've been sponsoring revolutions in your country ever since we kicked out Maximilian and we fell in love with Pancho Villa and yada, yada, yada. We're going to quit with that. And actually, you know what? You could actually go all the way back and be part of Spain again. You could resume your preferred name of Nueva España, or alternatively, in the 30s, most people don't know this, but due to the popularity of Hitler, Mexican Nazis were a huge thing. There was a big Mexican Nazi thing. They also had a Christian revolt where they could kind of go in this other direction of like a Handmaid's Tale, Mexico. That would be kind of cool. And you're just like, hey, Mexico, we love you. We'll always love you. We'll always be your friends. We love your food. You love our tourists. Whatever you want to do, do it. You say this to Mexico, and you mean it, and you have it demonstrated that you mean it. And, what effect does that have on whom? Well, I can tell you the effect that it has on whoever's the guy with the biggest balls in the Mexican army. He's basically like, I could very easily. Do you know what Mussolini did to the mafia? Yeah, and you don't know, but you can guess, and your guess would be right. And so
killed the shit out of them and said, "Stay in line, or else I'm gonna fuck you up."
Yeah, the Americans had to resurrect them to maintain order when they occupied Italy. And they were dead. And so, the idea of basically doing to Mexico what, for example, Paul Kagame did to Rwanda, where you're just like, no. There's no alternative to complete civil order. I mean, there's another. Let me tell the story that I was going to tell earlier. This is not my story. I actually read it in the paper, although it's unbelievable that someone would print something like this. Supposedly, there was an American diplomat in one of the Gulf states, and one day, one of these rich ass Emiratis comes to him and is like, "Hey, I thought I could help out because I know how you can win the war in Afghanistan." And the American was like, what? And the Emirati is like, oh, it's simple. I'll explain. And he's like, you see, I have hawks. I have these hawks. And we used to actually go to Afghanistan to hunt the bustard, with hawks, big Saudi prince thing. And look, I have this app on my cell phone that tells me where all of my birds are because they all have little tracking devices on them. And, here's how you can win the war in Afghanistan. Basically, just take all the Afghans and chip them the way I chip my hawks. And the American, and then, who probably had that IED, right? And the American looks at him and he's like, but that would violate their civil rights. and among other problems. But I mean, I'm not saying that is exactly the right solution, but it's sort of thinking outside, the box in a way that you don't.
American
liberal mindset. But here's what I'm getting. Why do we have to have the same standards for the Americans and them?
Right. And so when we basically say, put yourselves in the foot of the Generalissimo of Mexico or whatever, Maximilian IV, whatever he wants to call himself. He's just like, I'm just going to arrest all the drug lords and just restore order to Mexico.
He wouldn't. And
why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he?
Why would he? So
because
for instance,
he's trying to have control of his country. When you're in power, it's completely normal to want to destroy all competing power sources.
Sure, but why wouldn't you co-opt that power considering it could give you unlimited pussy and money? Right?
Because that's unlimited. You're El Presidente Maximo for LIFO. You have all the pussy, you have all the money. That's not a big deal.
Okay,